Welcome, and thank you for joining today's AgileLIVE webinar on the challenges and rewards of DevOps, Part 1. I'm Steve Ropa, an Agile consultant at version 1, and I'm excited to be moderating today's AgileLIVE webinar. These thought leadership webinars are focused on helping organizations scale Agile faster, easier, and smarter. Now, just a few basics to begin with, just logistics. The presentation is going to last approximately 60 minutes. We will answer questions either a couple times during the course of the presentation or towards the end. If we don't get to your question, we will follow up after the webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded, and we will be sending a link to the recording and the slides. In addition, you can claim 1 PDU credit for attending today's webinar. Our provider ID is 3576, and the webinar ID is V1048. For those of you who haven't used On24 before, I'd like to point out a few areas on the audience console. All participants are muted throughout the presentation, so if you have questions, please send them through the Q&A panel on your console. If you have technical questions, please send a note through the Q&A panel, and an On24 representative will be happy to assist you. I'd like to encourage everyone to share your aha moments with others during the event using the Twitter panel. In addition, here's information again on how to grab your credit, your PDU credit. Now I'd like to introduce to you Damon Poole. Damon Poole is the Chief Agilist at Eliason Group's Agile practice, which helps its clients with Agile transformation, checkup, and tune-ups, as well as a full Agile curriculum. In fact, his group is partnered with version 1 to help a large financial institution with its Agile transformation involving 500 teams. In addition, he's provided consulting for many other global organizations with hundreds of teams. He's a co-founder and past CEO and CTO of AccuRev, where he created multiple award-winning products, including AccuRev and AccuWorkflow. He's past president and vice president of Agile New England, and he's a frequent speaker and writer on Agile development topics. He's author of the webbook Do It Yourself Agile, and a pioneer in the area of multi-stage continuous integration and mixing Scrum and Kanban. So I'd like to turn it over to Damon at this point, and Damon, looking forward to hearing from you.
Well, Steve, thanks very much for that introduction. So we'll definitely be talking about DevOps today. And one of the things about DevOps is that, much like with any new topic, there's often a lot of different sort of views on it and perspectives and definitions and all that kind of stuff. So we'll get into the definition in a moment, but just want to lay some groundwork first. And a lot of this experience is based on real-life experience in the trenches. And DevOps is, while fairly new, there's a number of folks out there doing it today. And I'm aware of some organizations that I've worked with that were doing things that are now called DevOps as much as 4 or 5 years ago. So one of the things that I'd like to talk about first is hot fixes and patches. Right, so if you think about it, you've got a customer down situation or some kind of problem that's business critical that you need to fix that involves a change to the software, or maybe reconfiguring a server or something like that. But in any case, it's software related. Right, so think about that process. What does it take to get a hot fix or patch to your customer? And think about the steps you go through. So first, okay, there's a problem. How are we going to solve this? Oh, it's going to take us 8 hours to solve that. We don't really have 8 hours, so what are we going to do? Well, what's the smallest thing that we could do to provide that high value of fixing the problem? And usually you can figure out something, whether it's a workaround or whatever, in a short period of time, get it out there, make the change, do whatever testing you can, hopefully before you make the change, and then make sure that the problem is taken care of. And then if it was just a stopgap measure, as quickly as you can get the next best change or fix out there, and as soon as you possibly can, get the real solution, the long-term solution out there. And under those circumstances, think about when you've been involved in that in the past, right? Everything else is on hold. You drop everything else. That's the most important thing. So think about the time it takes from when something's reported to when your organization gets that out there and the customer, whether internal or external, is happy. That process is really a way to think about DevOps, right? What are we trying to do with DevOps? Why would you even bother? Well, the motivation, I believe, is to provide the highest value as fast as you can, which is exactly what you're trying to do with a hotfix or patch. It's the exact same process. So if you use this as a model in your thinking, that will really help. Now, I'm not saying that you should run around with your hair on fire all the time. Of course not. But that's why we're talking today. How can we get to this in a good way, in a sustainable way? Part of that involves learning. Part of that involves organizational change. Part of that involves tooling, right? So I'm not going to talk that much about tooling. This is part one of a two-part series, and Ian Culling and Andy Powell will be talking much more about tooling in the next section. So we talked about doing things rapidly with a hotfix or a patch. That's going to involve just a couple of people. So here's a model of an enterprise doing Agile at scale. You may have seen the Scaled Agile Framework, big picture, very similar concept. So the idea is that if you look closely in the middle, you can see these little, it looks like tables or something with little people around it. Right, so each one of those is an Agile team. And you can see there's multiple Agile teams in multiple overall programs, and they're all working to get things done. So whatever we do with DevOps needs to apply not just at the team level, but also at the multi-team level. Right? So, well, I guess that depends on how many teams you have and how many programs and their interrelationship. But at the end of the day, most folks that have operations groups, they are serving the needs of multiple teams. And so we need to take that into account, even if those multiple teams don't really have any software dependencies. Now, I've been using the term operations and dev, but I want to clarify that while the term is DevOps, when we talk about dev, we're really talking about development teams, which really means a team, which can include QA people, it could include BAs, it could include DBAs. And on the operations side, very often what we're talking about there, of course, is software that we're putting out either internally for internal use, or we're putting in the cloud, whether it's a private cloud or a regular cloud, and that's going to be something that the operations people do. And then there's also sometimes that's called release engineering. So if you're a release engineer, I'm using those terms fairly interchangeably. And then again, different organizations mean different things by operations. Sometimes that involves lots of other things in the organization. But for the purposes of this discussion, when I say dev, I mean an Agile team, and when I say ops, I mean the people responsible for taking the software and saying, okay, you know what, somebody's actually going to use this now. So whether it's shipping or making it live in production for end users, that's the definition of ops that I'm using. All right, so I think a great place to start in thinking about what is DevOps is to think about a very common phenomenon that happened prior to DevOps, which is the incorporation of QA into an Agile team. Years ago, that was really, a sort of a shocking idea. What? We're going to put QA people right in the team? How's that going to work? Right? Isn't that the fox guarding the hen house? Well, I think most of the shock has subsided, at least in the Agile community, right? That's sort of a normal thing to happen, SOP, in an Agile team these days. And to expand that idea, we're not really talking about merging all the roles on a team, having all the roles that you need. And one organization I worked with, the very large organization we were talking about earlier, one way that initially showed up was to have something like 20 or 30 different people on a matrixed Agile team because, okay, we need every role, right? So, well, that's a little bit too big. So really what we're talking about with a small cross-functional team is that not that you necessarily have all of the roles that you need, but you have all of the skills that you need. Right? So the idea of a cross-functional Agile team is that that team has everything needed to get whatever work is in their iteration backlog done at the end of that iteration. And so I'm making a Scrum reference there, but whether you're using Kanban or Scrum or some other thing, Scaled Agile, Enterprise Agility, whatever, we're still talking about the same thing. Getting something done on a regular basis by a team. Now in the real world, not everybody can do that right away, and here I'm just saying to the extent that you can, and of course the idea is the closer you can get to a small cross-functional team, the better. So one of the skills that I've put in here is operations and release engineering, right? So just as we brought the QA skills into the team, what we're talking about here is bringing operations and release engineering skills in. Now, depending on how you're set up, that may actually be a person. It may be, I hate to say half a person, but half a person, or it may be a person coming in on a consulting basis and offering their services to say, you know what, if you really want this to go live, let me help you with that. And we'll talk about that in more detail coming up. So if we keep in mind the idea of bringing the QA team, the QA person on the team, let's take a look at a very simple example here. So we have, in this case, 2 Agile teams, aka development teams, and 1 operations team, could be release engineering as well, right? So in order for those dev teams to get what they think of as shippable actually shipped, the operations team needs to come into play and look at things like provisioning and performance and all that kind of stuff, whatever their checklist is before it's actually deployed or shipped, right? And then it actually gets out there. So if you have multiple teams, right, you could have a bottleneck there. You could have some dependencies. There's a lot of complications there. So one organization that I worked with in the past had 7 Agile teams, and I bring this up because it's so convenient of an example, and they had an ops team that, actually they called it a release engineering team, but they had an ops team that had something like 8 or 9 people in it. And what they did was they experimented with the concept, and they started to embed a couple of people into some of the teams, and that worked out really well. In some cases, it was a clear one-to-one. In other cases, they had to do some more complicated things. I'm not going to get into that today, but eventually, over time, they ended up with a one-to-one. They still had an operations team that was responsible for making sure that of consistency and things that were independent of the individual teams, but they moved to more of this kind of picture here. Right, and they did it with 7 teams. I'm just doing 2 here as a simple example, and that makes that team all the more cross-functional. So that's one way of doing it. And that's, to the extent that you can, that's what you want to strive for. Now, you can't always do that. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a moment. But another thing that's important here is this is not just a moving of people and responsibilities and reorganization or anything like that. Very often, the tool set that is used by the Agile team or the dev team and the tool set that's used by the ops isn't always the same stack, right? So maybe they use different ticketing systems or different ways of moving software packages around or whatever. So part of the idea, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail on that, but part of the idea here is the tooling. And we're talking about tooling and automation, all that kind of stuff. One of the things that often happens is folks create DevOps teams, and they have DevOps people with a DevOps title. And you know what? There's really nothing wrong with that, because at the end of the day, the smoother you can make the path from I have something that needs to go into production to it's in production, that's the better. The more that you can smooth that out, the better. And if you create a team and you call it DevOps and they're helping the tooling, great. But really, the real vision of DevOps is to blur the distinction between development and ops. Now, I know a thing that often comes up as an objection here. Steve, I'm sure you've seen this as well. We were talking about this when we were preparing this, is that it comes up with, what about compliance? What about governance? What about sign-off? What about audits and that kind of stuff, right? So one of the things that it may seem like is we're trying to sidestep that. No, not at all, right? So if you have separation of concerns issues, that's perfectly fine and understandable. So it may very well be that operations person on the team is doing everything to make sure that the next step is simple, not removing the approval process. So one simple example there would be that you get everything staged and ready to go, they believe it's good, and then there's a person that is going to approve it, and they approve it through a tool, right? And they have all the information that they would normally have to say, has everything been followed? And since it was done in an automated way, there's a complete log with outputs and all that kind of stuff. So really what we're doing is we're making the process of doing the right thing even simpler, right? So separation of concerns is still going to be there. We're still going to honor that, and we're going to make it much simpler. Because at the end of the day, it's really about having a good audit trail, trusting the steps that were taken, and if we've automated most of that, I feel like you're going to be able to have more trust there, right? And so that automation comes in a lot of different ways. If we have different ticketing systems, right, then it's going to be harder to say what's actually in there. So if you're using something like version 1 to keep track of the stories, to keep track of the, whether you call them stories or tickets or tasks, to keep track of that consistently, that's, in my opinion, going to increase the trust level across the board. Steve, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you covered it really well, Damon. The idea that governance is always going to be an issue, and there's always going to be these questions, going back to the old ITIL days even. It's all about visibility and all about making sure folks are seeing it, seeing what the decisions were made, when they were made, and who's making them. And so, yeah, I think you covered it really well. That's one of those areas where tooling does kind of make it easier.
Absolutely. And I know you guys are going to, talk more about the tooling and the link integrations to other systems as well. So I really look forward to that in part 2. All right. So now you can't always do this embedding. So another group that I worked with had a fairly small operations team, and they had lots of teams. One of the things that comes out with Agile is that very often you have more faux teams than real teams, right? So if you might have, say, 100 people in IT, and then you've got 30 teams, but that's really because you've got everybody on 3 different teams. So one of the things that Agile tries, this is a little bit off topic, but it's a talking point, a thought point, is that the more you can work towards having real Agile teams working on one project and going to the next project, the easier it is to think about having an operations person dedicated to a particular team. So anyway, one organization I worked with, they found that they were able to embed 2 people, one on each team, because those 2 teams were releasing very frequently and were working on things that were really important to the organization at that point in time. And then they didn't do that with the other folks. And then what they did do, however, was a couple more folks they made basically into operations consultants. So they would go from team to team and offer advice. And we'll get into more of those examples in a moment. But just wanted to get the idea out here that just embedding a one-for-one, one person for one team is not the only way to go. But experimenting with that is a great way to understand if it's going to work in your organization, where the problems are. And one more thought on that is that often exposes, what, now that we've embedded this person on this team, we realized we were taking some shortcuts here, and we actually have a need for more ops folks, right? So that can cut both ways. All right. So there's a topic that I'm not really going to spend a lot of time on, continuous integration. That's getting to be kind of an older topic now. But if you're familiar with continuous integration, which I assume most of you are, that's really a piece of the process. That's saying that as we get code ready and we check it in, we go through the whole integration, unit tests, and all that kind of stuff. So that's great. But if continuous integration is a good idea, isn't continuous everything a good idea? And so this concept can extend all the way up into the business, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But really, anything that you're thinking of, that you've thought about with continuous integration can apply to continuous deployment, continuous staging, anything between when the developer checks in and you're ready to deploy, right? And so that can go all the way from business idea all the way to production. Now we're going to focus on the DevOps side of that, but just as with embedding the QA person, taking the idea of continuous integration to the next step, I think gives you a link to how to think about this. Okay, so let's look at that end-to-end for a moment. So we've got on the top here, the way I've separated this out is a very simplified pipeline, right? So there's more steps here, you could argue, fine. So I've separated into that pipeline into creative work and automatable work. Right? The basic idea of software development is we're trying to automate stuff, right? That's why we're in business. That's why we have software engineering, right? So we want to maximize the amount of creative work because really software development is puzzle solving. If it wasn't puzzle solving, it would be installing off-the-shelf software, right? So by definition, it is solving new problems, puzzle solving, which is creative work. We want to do as much on that side as possible. So things like manually deploying, manual testing. I'm not talking about exploratory testing, but manually going through a test plan. Anything that can be automated should be automated, right? The process of writing code, we've tried many times to automate that process. We don't seem to be there yet. Sure, some parts simplified, but if I can automate something like running a test suite, gathering data from clients, customers in the market, deploying, I should, right? So the other part of this is that the more you bring the different parts of this pipeline together, the more the need is there for using common tools and for automation. Right? So rather than thinking of it as we have these different silos of development, these different functional areas, at the end of the day, we really have the team. Now, this is a little bit simplified because you probably have multiple teams, and you may not bring the business person completely into the team, right? But to the extent that you can, you want to have it so that you have the team together, spending most of their time being creative, and then automate everything you can, right? So that means bringing the business person in closer, bringing the QA person in closer, bringing the operations or release engineering person in closer, and to simplify that, all of that, automation, right? So just a quick forward reference here to the version 1 tooling. They have a lot of great offerings in the area of the version 1 team room, for instance, so we can see everything in the same place, and we'll look at the card wall in a moment. But one way to see everything that's happening both in development and operations in one place is to have it all available in Team Room. Right? As far as gathering data, what should we be working on? You can use version 1 ideas to gather that, validate from customers in the market that they're really interested in that stuff, bring out things that maybe you didn't think about. And then on the build, test, and release side, the integrations with SCM systems, you name it, they've pretty much got it. Same with continuous integrations. And I say continuous integration, but it's really build automation. Continuous integration is just a piece of that. Right? So version 1 can really help you in a lot of different places to automate this as you look into not just DevOps, but the whole pipeline. All right, so how do we get there? All right, so this has been a fairly brief overview. I have some great book recommendations at the end. But now let's talk about, okay, this is fantastic, but how do we get there? What are some steps we can take? It's probably not going to happen overnight. All right, well, one great place to start is to start injecting operations thinking into the Agile teams, right? So that any problem that the Agile team can find operations-wise up front, the fewer problems you're going to have when it actually gets to production. The last thing you want to do is have something ready for production, quote unquote. You go to deploy it, and the ops folks say, no. And by the way, you're now fifth in line. You don't want that. Okay, so how does this work? Right, so you get somebody from the operations side to start going to the various Agile meetings of a team. I wouldn't recommend lots of teams at this point. Let's just get started, right? So going to the stand-ups, listening for things. Now, in the beginning, you don't necessarily want to interrupt and all that. Just be listening and thinking, wow, there's a lot of opportunity here and there. Maybe take somebody aside and say, hey, did you think about this? Did you think about that? Right, so that people start to recognize you and understand that you're there for them. Right, so that's a good experiment. Another thing is you can say, hey, do you guys have a published definition of ready? Could I take a look at that? And then maybe go to the retrospective and just be a fly on the wall, right? You want to get yourself invited back and say, hey, I noticed your definition of ready doesn't have anything here about making sure that there's enough bandwidth available for this new deployment or whatever it is that on the operations side will need to change for them to say, yeah, this should go into production. Maybe we should add that so that before you start working on any new story, you make sure that when it gets to operations, it's really going to be ready. Same thing for definition of done, and then going to iteration planning and see, oh, those are the stories that are coming up. You know what? None of those really have any impact on operations, nothing to say there. Or another meeting you might go to and say, wow, it looks like you got a lot coming up that's really going to impact operations. Have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? Start getting that thinking in there. And then the same thing for review. When somebody says, all right, look, here are the stories we completed. Here's how it's going to work. You might realize things there. And then we've already covered the retrospective. So that's a great way to get started. Now, you might think if you're in operations, you might think, I barely even have time to go to this webinar, and you want me to go to all these meetings? Sure, absolutely, understood. Well, the next thing you can think about is maybe this is not the place to start for you, right? That's your call, something to think about. Maybe the place to start for you on the operations side is how can we streamline some of what we're doing to free up some time to do that. Okay, so then the next thing that you can look at here is how can we on the operations side go Agile? Right now, I'm not saying folks on the operations side, so I'm a former release engineer, and I was very involved in release engineering and operations, and I know you got a lot of work to do. Not saying you're doing anything wrong or anything like that, absolutely not. But one of the things that I find when operations teams start to take on some of this Agile stuff is that you'll have more levers to say, you know what, we can't do that right now. Here's why. We need more folks. Yeah, that's really great, but I'll tell you what, here's what you need to do before we even start putting that on our queue. Right? So there are things that you can do. Not saying that you're doing anything wrong. Right? How can we optimize? How can we learn from Agile? Right? So some of the ways that really work well, I'm not saying go Scrum. Right? That doesn't necessarily make sense. 2-week iterations. Nope. Don't have to do that. But having stand-ups is useful. Having retrospectives is useful. Having a focus, yeah, of course you're focused on the customer, but even more focus on the customer. Who really is our customer? Right? Where are these requests coming from? How can we make that relationship better? Are there ways we can break work down? So one example, I was working with an organization recently that was installing a new firewall because what was happening was the firewall between the hardware that they had and the rules that they had was slowing transactions, and these were financial transactions, down enough that some of the transactions were getting dropped and restarted, and it was really annoying their customers. So they had planned to, at the same time, install new hardware and rewrite the firewall rules, but what they decided, taking a very agile approach, was, you know what, let's just replace the firewall hardware first and then do the rules rewrite next, because we're going to get some performance boost from just the hardware and then another boost from the rules. And, they really needed to get that out because it was an active problem. Acceptance criteria. So somebody asks you for something and you say, well, how will you know that I've satisfied what you need? So attaching to tickets, you don't have to call them stories, by the way, tickets, whatever it is, tasks. The idea of acceptance criteria, getting up front, what's going to make folks happy. Now, Scrum Master seems to imply that you're going to do Scrum. I'm not saying that. But having somebody that is keeping track of what is our process. Do we have stand-ups? When do we have stand-ups? Do we have retrospectives? When do we have retrospectives? That concept is very useful. Same thing for the product owner. I was working with one organization that had, oh my goodness, how many? 10 different teams all making demands on their ops teams. And yes, they were using a ticketing system, but deciding which tickets to work on, there was no one person to do that. Now that sounds like an impossible task, but within operations you have both small interrupt-driven work, and then you also have project work. I'm saying more for the sort of project work, the larger requests. You can have somebody that is the one person to go to with those that says, all right, here's the order we're going to go through, instead of tapping everybody on the shoulder all the time. Right? So it's up to you to decide which of these is going to make sense for you, but something to think about. A backlog, just having a stacked list, even if you don't have a product owner, people can say, you know what, if you're working together, sitting near each other, can say, I don't agree. I happen to know that, for these reasons, we should do this first. Oh, okay, I agree. Great, let's move this down lower. Right? So making that visible, everybody can see what's going on. A card wall, which we'll talk more about in a moment, and having work in progress limits, which we'll also talk more about in a moment. Steve, any thoughts where you've seen some of these work?
Actually, I think pretty much all of them. The beauty of the rise of DevOps sounds like this nirvana thing of, hey, we can actually deliver all the time, we can deliver in an automated fashion, but it was Agile that brought that together. Having these pieces, these items, such as acceptance criteria, such as the stand-ups, a card wall for sure. That's where the power came in, and I think we finally reached a nice confluence of activities so that we can make these things happen. We will have a couple questions on those at the end during the Q&A also. Okay, great.
Awesome. All right, so speaking of card wall, now I just want to sort of clarify a couple of terms here. So people use the terms storyboard, task board, Kanban board, Scrum board, card wall, and they all sort of blur together. Personally, I like to use the generic term card wall. So we have a wall, it has cards on it. I don't know if the cards are tasks, I don't know if they're stories, whatever. And then it keeps the word Kanban and Scrum out of there so that we don't confuse the terms, right? So I can be doing Scrum with a card wall, doesn't mean I'm doing Kanban, right? So that's better than saying we use a Kanban board, because that implies, oh, we're doing Kanban. But, whatever. Just a thought there. So in this case, I am specifically talking about Kanban, but it also involves a card wall, which does not require you to do Kanban. And I think in version 1, you guys you've got a Kanban setting, right? I'm not going to go into the details, but I know you can configure the tool for, and I've got a screenshot coming up, for Kanban, but you also have storyboards and task boards. So right, there's a lot of functionality and configuration in there. So the basic ideas with Kanban is that work is managed visually. So if you've been using Scrum, you probably, there's a good chance, because many high-performing Scrum teams do have these, you have something like, to do, work in progress, done. That's the classic. And these particular columns that I have here, backlog, on deck, coding, testing, except done, those are just for the purposes of discussion. Whatever columns make sense to you is great. And what I find is that when folks start using a card wall, the columns up there tend to change pretty rapidly and take a little while to settle down. So one of the good ways to get started with that is actually to use a physical board. But the thing about a physical board is, it's hard to see that physical board from home or from far away. So at the end of the day, really you do want to use a tool in there as well. And sometimes people are they're pretty passionate about the physical card wall, and so they'll maintain both. And that's actually incredibly simple to do. All right, so first thing about Kanban is work is managed visually. So whatever work I have has to be there. It can't be hidden. No defects in a different system. No, oh yeah, there's this other thing that I didn't put up there. No, it's managed visually. So whether you're on the ops side or the dev side, you can start using something like this, and then it makes it easier for dev and ops to come together, right? And hopefully eventually use the same tooling. But you can work towards ops on the dev side, and ops you can work towards the dev side, right? So eventually coming together. So little steps until we get there. So work is managed visually is step one. Step two is limited work in progress. Now this is a very complicated topic, though it is actually very simple in nature. So the idea of setting work in progress limits is you want to say, hey, for instance, in this case, we can only have 3 things on deck. We can only have 3 things that we're coding, only have 3 things that we're testing. Actually, in this example, I'm not including anything that's really on the ops side, but you can imagine that instead of the except column there, or maybe in addition, I have, ops ready. So you have somebody that has, from the ops side, come and looked at it and said, okay, you know what, looks like you guys have done all the right things. That story seems like it's ops ready, or deployment ready, or whatever. Right? Every organization has different terms. So you want to set limits on that, right? Because the idea is that if you have too much work that is piling up in any one area, you're going to run into problems. So imagine you've got a whole bunch of stuff in testing that hasn't been tested, and now you're going to go write new code. Wouldn't you really want to get feedback first before starting coding on something new? You might find out that you've gone down a complete dead end and have to go back and rewrite a lot of that stuff. Same thing on the ops side. Wouldn't you want to get feedback on at least one story first if you're going in a new direction, and have them say, oh, you've forgotten this thing, and then apply that learning to all the other stories? Of course you would. Now, where you set these limits is up to you. Generally, people will start out with fairly loose limits. In this case, I've set a limit of 3 per column, and then you might see that different columns need different limits. And this will also change your behavior, right, or allow you the opportunity to change your behavior. You might be a developer, for instance, and say, wow, there's a lot of stuff piling up in testing. There's already a test plan for this. I can manually run through it, or you know what, I can help out with the automation of it, and then I'll go back to coding. It helps everybody, because remember, the goal here with Agile is to get work done, not just to do your own work. So same thing on the ops side, right? So if there's a bunch of, if you have a list of things that you need to do to be ready for production, having those stories pile up, not a great idea. So you might be able to say, okay, well, instead of writing some new code, I'm going to go through that checklist. Have we done this? Have we done that? Great. And you might say, well, I actually don't know how to do that, or I don't have access to that server. Okay, but do what you can. And I would say think of those limits as a rumble strip. Sometimes you just got to do what you got to do, and you got to go over the limit, but know that you're going over the limit and that you don't want to be there. And lastly, flow is pull-based. So the idea is that, let's say, I've finished the coding work, and moving it to the right side of that means it's ready for testing, but I'm not going to pull it into testing because there's no room. Right? So I've got some developers, I've got some testers, I've got a product person, or let's say an ops person there. So now the developer's going to go and help with the testing. All right, so that went in. Let's say that went into production, right? And all right, that's ready to go on to the next spot. It goes. We've made room now. We can say that this task is now in testing, and I can go back over to what I really want to do, which is write some more code. Yay! All right, so that's the basic idea of Kanban. And here's an example of it in version 1. It's very similar. And I'm not going to talk about this a lot, but just to know that if you're using version 1, you can make use of some of these ideas right away just by enabling the Kanban board. Okay, so that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. Here are just 3 books: Continuous Integration, Continuous Delivery, and Continuous Delivery in DevOps, a quick start guide. So those are the 3 that I personally recommend. It's a good starting place. There's a lot of other books out there. There aren't as many on DevOps as one might like, but there's a lot of great blogs out there you can Google. But I would say that starting with reading the book Continuous Delivery in DevOps is a great place to start before going further. So I guess this is a good time. Steve, any other sort of thoughts you wanted to add in before we get into Q&A?
We've got some pretty darn good questions that cover a lot of thoughts, and I certainly didn't want to interrupt your flow there. So also, huge agreement on those books. Those are the ones to pick up, and I would second the suggestion starting with Continuous Delivery in DevOps. So without further ado, you want to jump into some of these questions?
Sounds great. What have we got?
Okay, so I'm noticing a couple of categories, and I'm going to give you a couple of these categories. They're coming in fast now. The questions are really coming in. So a couple of the categories that I'm seeing, one is around governance, and the other is around a little bit more of the operational details. I'd like to start with the governance ones just to get those out in the open there. The first was actually a comment from Bill, who is at DHS. He said, I do the SDLC and Agile at DHS. You need to make sure that the governance process in SDLC you have at your organization offers the ability to tailor fully to Agile. I think that's an important reminder. This is a good reminder, but that led to a couple of questions, one of which was, can DevOps work in combination with ITIL? We have an Agile development organization, but our ops organization is using ITIL. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. At the end of the day, so both on the governance point and the ITIL, the word governance and the ITIL point, governance is just a word, right? So whatever you've got in place for controls today, you've got the purpose the control is trying to serve and how you've implemented it. Right, so we're not saying that you need to choose new controls or at the high level change the reasons why you're doing governance. The idea is look at the implementation there and say how can I tweak that or change that to fit into that model, right? So how can I change the current implementation? And it's the same thing with ITIL. Now, I'm not an ITIL expert, but my understanding is that ITIL is a set of guidelines that you need to customize within your environment. And again, it's, okay, I'm doing ITIL in a certain way in my organization today. How can I tweak that to serve the same purposes? Right? So we're not saying take any shortcuts or anything like that. And then I think there's another good point in there about SDLC. Now, the interesting thing about SDLC is that software development lifecycle is, let's see, how can I put this? So this is sort of a big point, but Scrum, okay, so I'll talk about Scrum instead of the wider Agile. Scrum, for instance is saying replace. I know that's scary, but bear with me for a minute. Replace your SDLC with Scrum and iterations. And that's not easy to do overnight, right? So I got budgeting, and I got approvals, and I got requirements gathering, and all that kind of stuff. But that's the whole point of Scrum, is saying start to change how you do that work if you really want to get stuff out faster. Scrum is not a fantastic way to type faster or somehow some magic way to do things in shorter time. No, it's how do we change it. So looking at how can I change my SDLC to work with Agile, with ITIL, with governance, it's not easy. But that's what we're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah, I've seen a lot of good work done in that area, and whenever I see that, I see the governance piece being an area where we really want to. We're not saying change the world. We're saying change how we do these things to make it so that it's a little more visibility.
A brass tacks example there is, if you bring the tooling together, if you have fewer systems of record, it's more likely that things are going to be correct, which is what we really want with governance, right? We want to make sure that things are correct, the process is being followed.
And that we can see where that was happening. Now, it's interesting you mentioned Scrum. We have a couple of questions that kind of touch on Scrum-specific areas. So I'm going to ask two of them, and because I think they're going to fit nicely together. One is, how does continuous everything concept apply to Agile planning, which is now a set of discrete events other than the ongoing grooming stuff? And one that really I just love their question. Many companies with multiple teams have a hardening phase before deployment. Does that affect the concept of bringing ops into an Agile team?
Oh boy, I think I need a beer. So that was a mouthful. I'm going to address that last point, and then if you think there's something I missed there, let's go back to it. Hardening sprint, right? So if you look at, so this is going to sound a little purist, and I understand that. That's not my intention. But if you look at what Scrum is saying, not some variation of Scrum, but Scrum by the Scrum Guide, there's no such thing as there's only one kind of sprint, and that is the sprint. And in the sprint, you accomplish whatever's in your sprint backlog at the end of the sprint, and that's it. Now, that's hard to achieve, and I would not frown at anybody that's got a hardening sprint. I would say what I just said and say, hey, let's make some progress towards not having that. But the idea is, how can we move all of the work that we do in the quote-unquote hardening sprint to be within a sprint? And, one of the obvious ways there we've already talked about is automation. Another way is getting to more cross-functional teams, right? It is a journey, and any step you can take is going to make it simpler and reduce the work in that quote-unquote hardening sprint. The way I prefer to think of it is you have a release tail, and that you're just going to keep doing regular sprints, but maybe during the release tail, sprints that overlap with the release tail, you do more sort of ops, quote, hardening, rel-eng kind of stuff. But you want to try to think of the release tail as something to get rid of over time.
That is my thinking exactly. I try to describe to folks a hardening sprint as a stage that some folks necessarily need to use until they can get to the sprint. And again, hopefully over time that starts to go away. And a huge shout out for automation there. How can we get a lot of these things to fit into the sprint? Those automation tools that you talked about earlier. I think they're a real key to helping us to get there. A couple of other questions have popped in. One was actually, it was a comment, but I think it very much supports some of what you were saying, which is on the topic of inserting the ops skills into the Agile team. Andrew said, we did something similar. We added an ops person to one Agile team and had them coach the others in the next iteration, thus upping the skills of the teams rather than just adding to the staff level. So as you pointed out, I thought very well, it's about the skills.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's right, just to sort of riff on that a little bit, we're not saying that that the Agile team is going to replace the need for an ops person, for instance. Like, you're not saying that you're going to an ops person is going to come in there and just make everybody on that team, a virtual ops person. We're saying that we're going to do that to the extent that we can, and then that ops person, quote, only has to do the things that really, that ops person is the only person that can really do it, right? It's at the end of the day, we've got a person doing ops because they're good at it, and we've got a person writing code because they're good at it, et cetera.
Yeah, for sure. So along those lines, the question that came along, and should be a pretty straightforward one. The theory of a developer moving over to help with testing if their code complete on item is very interesting. What happens if the only work available is their own?
Well, that's a good question. I can't say it's the first time I've heard it. A totally valid question, right? So then if the only work available to test is their own, then I would guess that there isn't any other test work to be done, so there really isn't a bottleneck. So I'm not sure how that really comes to pass, but let's say it does. Okay, great. I don't know, right? So that's a problem that you pose to yourself. That's part of the idea of things like Scrum and whatnot, is that it will find the problems for you and then you solve them. I don't know the context-specific answer to that. It may be that you got to ask the question of why isn't there more automation, or maybe in that environment it's his stuff because his stuff keeps having bugs in it because he refuses to write unit tests or whatever. It's very context-specific, but that's exactly the getting into that situation and having to solve that problem is exactly what you want to have happen.
Sure. Yeah, I agree. And then just a huge plug from my part there for acceptance test-driven development. If we have a ton of automated acceptance tests, it doesn't matter if it's your own code that's making those tests pass. It's still an excellent test. I did get a little bit of feedback. The other question that I kind of glommed together with the one on the hardening sprint about continuous agile, apparently we didn't answer that one as clearly as the questioner would like.
Okay.
How does continuous everything concept apply to agile planning, which is currently a set of discrete events other than the ongoing grooming stuff?
Oh, okay. Well, first off, and I don't mean this in I mean this in a very friendly way, there really isn't any such thing as, quote, agile planning. Now, that doesn't mean there's no planning in Agile. I just mean that Agile is the manifesto, and the only reference to planning there is along the lines of, planning's important, but working software is more important. There is planning in Scrum, however, right? So the point I'm making there is Scrum is not, equal Agile. There are many more ways to do Agile. So if you want to go to continuous everything, right, one of the ways to make that really continuous, as opposed to continuous meaning mostly continuous except for some things it's every week or every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks, you could take a look at Kanban. Kanban is continuous, everything, including planning, just-in-time planning. And that's a big topic all by itself, but, we're not focusing here on Kanban. But if you look at a high-performing Scrum team, and I would call a high-performing Scrum team one that's shippable every iteration and is doing something called one-piece flow, which means that they have stories done not just magically at the end of the iteration, but all throughout the iteration. You're basically doing Kanban. Surprise! It's kind of like the creamy center of the Oreo there. Kanban is like the creamy center of Scrum. After you do your iteration start, you're basically doing Kanban, and then you do your iteration end. So go and take a look at Kanban for that if that's appealing.
Great idea. So that's the list of questions. And wondering, do you have any last thoughts you wanted to throw out there before we did the final slides on what's coming up?
Let's see. I guess nothing in particular. I guess just off the top of my head, one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot lately is that just a reminder that Agile really is just the stuff in the manifesto. And if you haven't gone to look at the manifesto in a while, take a look at it. It's not just the 4 values, but there's also, click at the bottom, there's 12 principles. Just go through each one and say, hey, do I believe in this? And if not, it might be a good thing to say, well, why not? Is there some reason? And one of my favorites is, which I think is germane to this conversation actually, welcome changing requirements even late in development. And to really put a point on that, I would say, an extreme version of that I like to use is, it's the last day before deployment. And there's a story, it's 9 a.m., there's a story that you're intending to get done by the end of the iteration, the end of the day. And somebody comes in, the product owner, for instance, comes in and says, hey, I have this other story that I think, is about the same size it was, when we did our backlog grooming. Could you do this story instead? And the team says, yeah, sure. Right? So that's, that sounds pretty scary when I say that to most folks. But if you're doing something like DevOps, well, that's a lot easier. And shouldn't it be easy and safe to do that? I think it should.
Absolutely. And I'm going to add on to that the corollary, which is working software is the primary measure of progress. Those principles are fantastic. Great idea to remind folks to take another look at that. So thanks again. Now, just a couple of other minor things I want to do here. I want to remind folks that we have another session of the Challenges and Rewards of DevOps, Part 2, next Wednesday, October 29th, from 12 to 1 Eastern Daylight Time. And Ian and Andy are going to be discussing how an Agile Lifecycle Management platform can accelerate the benefits of DevOps. And finally, thank you for joining us today. Thank you for participating. Thank you for all those questions, and everybody enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Steve.